great. All right, so we're recording. Jorge, I'm going to pass it over to you. Yeah, take it away.
Well, thank you so much, Rebecca, and hello to everybody who's both watching us live and as well as many people who will watch this later on. My name is Jorge Baron. I'm the Executive Director of Northwest Immigrant Rights Project, and I'm pleased to be able to host this event, this webinar today to talk about an interesting and an important intersection of our immigration system and the issue of gender-based violence. This is part of a series of webinars that we've been doing where we try to focus a little bit kind of on broader issues. A lot of times when a NWIRP hosts events, we're kind of talking specifically about the day-to-day work that NWIRP does. And I want to, caution that we're taking like a broader view today. So it'll definitely intersect with work that Northwest Immigrant Rights Project is doing, but we wanted to talk a little bit more both about historical as well as looking to the future. And we'll certainly touch on the fact that we recently had an election that's going to change certainly the policies in this area. So we want to acknowledge that and talk a little bit in a minute. But first, I want to introduce, because most of this conversation will be with our wonderful expert and friend, Grace Wong, who is joining us today. She currently is serving as the policy director of the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence. But Grace has a long career in this area, which I'll ask her to share a little bit about, but also that career includes work with us both as a board member and as during law school working at Northwest Immigrant Rights Project. So we're honored that Grace is spending time with us because she does amazing work in advocating for in this area. And we're lucky to have her here in Washington State, even though she's now working on policies at national level, but also working at the state level. So we're really pleased, Grace, for you to join us today.
Thank you, Jorge. And when I was asked to do this, I said, of course, this NWIRP is where I started doing this work almost 30 years ago. And I will always happy to help. And I love seeing all the great things that staff and the organization are doing these days. So.
That's great. Well, thank you, Grace, for sharing your expertise and your time with us. So let's get started on the conversation. And just to reinforce what Rebecca said earlier, please, as we go through this, we'd invite you to type in your questions, and I'll be kind of monitoring that and try to, as questions emerge, to try to bring them into the discussion. And then we'll leave some time, hopefully at the end, to address any questions that don't get addressed during our discussion. But Grace, I'd love for you to just give us a little bit more of just so that people kind of understand a little bit about where your perspective comes from, and just tell folks a little bit about how you personally got interested in this intersection of our immigration system and the issue of gender-based violence. How did your career path put you at that intersection and become an expert?
Sure. So I started volunteering at Northwest Immigrants Rights Project back in the early 90s when I was in law school and was staff. I did intake at that time. I think it looks a little bit different now, but I, talked to whoever was calling during my shift and whoever walked in and tried to figure out whether they were eligible for some kind of immigration relief. And I, was doing that because of my language skills and because of my interest in immigration and being a child of immigrants myself. But over the course of the time that I spent both, at Northwest Immigrant Rights Project, as well as in, different activities at school, and at the particular time, the work that was happening at Northwest Immigrant Rights Project, there, I, developed a strong relationship with what was the beginning of the VAWA unit there. That was right after the Violence Against Women Act passed in 1994. There was some work being done on trying to implement the first protections for immigrant survivors in our immigration laws. Well, a set of our, the regulations in the Violence Against Women Act, and also at the same time, something really impactful in the Asian and Pacific Islander community happened. Many of you may have heard about the murders or the homicides at the courthouse. Susanna Blackwell, who had come as a sponsored fiance or spouse of an American citizen, was killed at the courthouse with two of her friends in the Filipino community. And there was a lot of activism, organizing around, putting together resources specifically for Asian and Pacific Islander immigrant women because of their isolation. And so I started, that sparked my interest. And after law school, I had the pleasure of working at Columbia Legal Services, and was doing a lot of work. This was at a time when welfare reform had just passed, the IRA. I can't even remember. The big immigration law of 1996 had just passed. There was a lot of work happening because of huge shifts in policy relating to access to public benefits, as well as penalties for immigrants who had entered the US without authorization. And so I just really, started doing the work, just dove right in. And I had the fortune also, after leaving legal services, to work with Gibbs Houston Powell, a local law firm, and where one of the partners is one of the founding attorneys of NWIRP, and really saw how survivors ended up in all sorts of different types of immigration matters. And it wasn't just folks that were eligible for VAWA protections. There were survivors in the asylum process. There were survivors that ended up in deportation that might not have been eligible for VAWA protections. And so, based on that, practical experience, doing immigration and removal defense, and the experience I had in legal services, doing public benefits work, I just really saw this intersection where it's really important to get how all of the different issues, whether it be the criminal legal system, the immigration system, the housing, the welfare system, all of those things, how if you really want to do holistic support for immigrant survivors, helping them overcome abuse and or overcome, get safe, I guess, both at a personal level, safe from their abuser, as well as safe from our systems, quite frankly, that penalize immigrants or make them ineligible for all sorts of protections that would otherwise be there. That's where I really saw the intersections. And so I have brought that to my work for the last 20 some years at the state level, where I worked at a domestic violence statewide coalition, as well as now at the national level. So long story short, I guess, or short story, I don't know, whatever.
Well, you have a lot. You have a lot to share, and I'm going to ask you a question that might prompt a similarly long answer. But if so, I do want us to in a little bit talk a little bit about sort of the more recent issues that the current Trump administration, the outgoing, I should say, Trump administration has had on this area of law. But for folks who might be kind of new to this intersection, right? Who might understand, who might be familiar with some of the issues around gender-based violence, and maybe familiar with immigration law, but are maybe new to how those two intersect. What are the kind of main barriers that you've seen in your career as impacting survivors when it comes to the immigration system?
Well, our immigration system, there are a lot of needs and for what's the word? Reform, I guess, but a lot of our immigration system, about 2/3 of our, or 60% of our, 2/3 of our immigration is based on family relationships to folks that, or legal immigration for permanent residents, I'll say, folks enter through a family member. And so, a lot of the work that we've done over the years has been to make sure that people who have experienced domestic violence in particular don't remain in abusive relationships because of their immigration status. And we know that, from our work over the years, that abusers, perpetrators, people who are wanting to exploit folks leverage immigration status or lack thereof, or unsecure immigration status as a tool to be able to further exploit people, to take advantage of them or abuse them. And so, the Violence Against Women Act that the provisions we passed in 1994, as well as some of the earlier provisions relating to conditional residency, recognize that there's that intersection there that, and those provisions seek to take away that tool to engage in leveraging the system. But we also know that in other parts of our system, whether it be through employment-based cases, or in whatever other pathway there might be for residency, that continues to be a challenge, where folks can exploit workers in particular. I mean, that's a huge gap. There are a lot of ways that employers can exploit their workers, and there's not good, people stay in challenging work situations because they fear retaliation through the immigration system. We also, as I'm working in the field of gender-based violence, I'm always trying to educate my colleagues around the fact that people being undocumented or not having status at all, or unsecure status, just makes them much more vulnerable to people being able to exploit them or commit domestic violence or commit sexual assault or other harms. And there are going to be, they're much more vulnerable and have fewer ways to fight back, or, it just gives abusers and perpetrators more tools. And so, as we do our work, we continue to try to educate policymakers as well as the community about why it's so important that people be able to regularize their status.
Thanks, Grace. And again, even before we get into sort of the last 3 years and and also I want to ask you about the pandemic and the impact that that's had. But just even before we get to that topic, I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about what's still missing. So we talked, you mentioned a little bit about the forms of protection that have been created, both through the Violence Against Women Act, and then some of the later issues like U visas, for example, that are one of the tools that Congress has created. But what have been the challenges in implementing those? Like what's missing? What's preventing people? What's preventing those tools from being as effective as they might otherwise be?
Oh, how long do I have? Well, I will say, so the U visa is one area that we spend a lot of time on, because I think people are somewhat familiar with it. It was created in the year 2000. It was not implemented until about 2007, 2008. It went for a really long time before people were able to actually apply for it. And the U visa requires that there be a certification from a law enforcement official that states that the individual has been helpful in the investigation or prosecution of certain criminal activity that's listed in the law. And we have, over the years, seen really big challenges with implementation of the U visa program. Not only that delay, but now because of the larger lack of paths towards regular status for people, and because of the vulnerability of immigrants who don't have status, that program is oversubscribed. I mean, there's a limit of 10,000 visa use a year. And right now we have over 200,000 people sitting, waiting to have a U visa issued. So that's just one glaring challenge, that there are only 10,000 visas a year. And we continue to work to try to raise that cap or remove the cap on the number of visas. But the other challenge with that is over the years, including in the past administration, U visa wait times, the agency that processes them may not have prioritized processing the cases. And so somebody could apply and they, in the past would be issued deferred action, and they would be able to get a work permit, usually within 6 months to a year and a half. And in the last few years, this administration has chosen to not process the cases until there's going to be a U visa available within the next year. And so right now, cases are taking about five years before a case is even opened, and folks are left in limbo, not knowing whether they're going to be potentially subject to immigration enforcement before their U visa is even processed. The other big challenge, and I noticed this in the chat, is that as we're having these larger conversations right now in our society, but this has been an ongoing conversation in the immigration field for years, is that the U visa process relies on this certification process from local law enforcement, and requires that a form be filled out. And there are a lot of people who, particularly in immigrant communities, and particularly in eras where there's seen to be there's fear that law enforcement may be collaborating with immigration enforcement. There's fear of contacting the police to begin with. Immigrant survivors may be unaware that law enforcement may even be a helpful support in a certain community or not, especially those coming from countries where law enforcement is not helpful at all, and may be a source of harm themselves. And so that's, it's an ongoing struggle that we've had in the field around this law enforcement certification process. And there have been discussions over the years to try to relax that somewhat. And we also have that process. We've been trying to make it not quite so formal or not so stringent in terms of how that happens. And so there are those issues. We also see, that's just in the context of the U visa itself. But we also have, challenges in other areas of law. Those that are fleeing violence, sexual and domestic violence, for example, and fleeing to the United States. We've seen a lot of news coverage about asylum seekers who are, have seen their family members killed, or women who have, experienced extensive sexual abuse and violence, fleeing to the United States, and are, traditionally, gender violence may not be recognized in the same way as other forms of violence, may not be recognized in the asylum system. And we can talk about that more in a minute. But there are just a lot of gaps and challenges that we have overall in the immigration system, that don't recognize the ways in which survivors of gender-based violence, might be eligible for relief. And so I'll leave it there, and I guess we can go down in more detail if you want it.
Yeah, no, Grace, I appreciate it, because that was a good overview of a lot of issues. And I just wanted to note on the U visa certification process that, Grace was one of the people who helped inspire a very significant change here at the state level, which was what ultimately became a state law that requires law enforcement agencies here in Washington State to actually certify which is kind of a discretionary action in most places, but in Washington State, there's more of a requirement to actually at least respond and make a determination of whether the person complies, which has been very helpful in helping achieve. I don't know if I want to say cooperation, because sometimes it's kind of grudgingly, but at least that there's actual action. And so we've appreciated, and our colleagues at the Office of Crime Victims Advocacy lead a task force that's been working to make sure that that actually becomes a reality, because like any policy, having oversight and follow-up is really important. So we appreciated that work, and I think it has made a big difference here in Washington State, and has made the state a leader in implementing these type of policies, despite a lot of the challenges that Grace alluded to. But Grace, I just want to commend you, because you helped get that movement going. So I did want to just explore a little further the issue of asylum, because I know it's one that we've had to work a lot in, and just in my own experience working in cases. This issue of we talked a little bit about some of the protections for people who are facing gender-based violence here in the U.S., but this issue of it being kind of a transnational issue of people having to escape gender-based violence in other countries, and particularly we've seen a lot of cases coming from countries like El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala in particular. And when I talk to people about asylum, a lot of people think of asylum as something that will provide protection if you're facing any kind of harm in your home country, right? And then, I have to explain to them there's actually like the reason you're going to face harm is actually important, which for a lot of people is kind of like arbitrary, right? Like, why does it matter, why I'm going to get killed, to afford me protection, but yet that's how our refugee law is constructed, and how the international framework of refugee protection is constructed. And then when I explore like the reasons, I talk about the fact that the reasons are race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. A lot of people sort of, connect those to kind of our discrimination laws here in the United States, right? And some of the same categories. But the one that seems very glaringly missing is, sex or gender, is not in the list, right? It's not one of the reasons that is granted protection. And so, could you kind of help elaborate as to like why? I mean, if you want to talk about the history of why that is, that might be a long story, but what is being done to sort of incorporate, like, what's the status of that? Because as you mentioned, the Trump administration has been undermining some of the earlier efforts to try to include gender-based violence in the category of harms that could qualify for protection. What's the status of that? Where are we right now?
Okay. Oh, so there's been a lot of activity in that arena, but I'm just going to step back a little bit. And so, as you mentioned, Jorge, the reasons for which you can get protection under our international treaties, as well as under asylum law in the U.S., are based on persecution for reasons relating to race, religion, nationality, or membership in, or political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. And, we have long, case law that builds up around, what does it mean to be persecuted, first of all. So, there's the language of what constitutes persecution, and all sorts of debate or not. I mean, depending on your perspective, on whether or not the harms that survivors of gender-based violence have actually experienced persecution, depending on the kind of harm. And for those of us who do domestic violence work, for example, know that domestic violence constitutes a pattern of coercive and controlling behaviors. It's a pattern. You look at the impact cumulatively, and that is somewhat what the case law looks like around what persecution looks like. And so that's, there are some analogies there that advocates over the years have really tried to push to try to explain, what that, survivors of gender-based domestic violence in particular, or other forms of gender-based violence, have experienced persecution. And obviously, when you've suffered, physical violence with severe injury, I mean, that should meet that definition. But you know, that's one discussion. But I think the larger and more challenging discussion we're having these days is whether, you know, what who might, you know, are you being persecuted based on your membership in a particular social group? There has been recognition since the mid 80s of, you know, a particular social group involves, you know, having immutable characteristics. It means like they're characteristics about a person that can't be changed. And then the person has to show that they've been targeted for those reasons. And so, you know, violations of women's rights over the years have been categorized in the law and in the analysis as, you know, expressions of cultural norms, or maybe they were mandated by religion. And so, you know, abuse, child abuse, domestic violence, sexual assault weren't always seen in the context of the political, you know, like a political being worth protected in a public or political realm. And so this has been one of the ongoing challenges we've had over the years is recognizing that the unique harms that women and children in particular experience merit public protection. And so over the last 2 or 3 years, despite years and years of case law that recognize, you know, some of the unique forms in ways that women experience persecution, for example, 1996, one of the first Board of Immigration Appeals decisions called Matter of Kasinga, the board ruled that you know, the physical and psychological harm inflicted by female genital cutting met the legal definition of persecution, and that Fasia Kasinga was eligible for protection and asylum in the United States. And so that was like in the United States, kind of the genesis of, you know, years and years of analysis around the kinds of harm that women and children in particular experience, and whether that, you know, whether that merits protection under our refugee protections or our asylum law. And so what we've seen over the years, there was soon after the Kasinga case, you know, there was a case involving a domestic violence survivor from Guatemala where Roni Alvarado, in a matter of RA, she was found to be eligible based on some of the same analysis or similar analysis to the Kasinga case, where she was found eligible for asylum. And what happened back then was there was a change in administration, and the Attorney General certified, I believe, the case and overturned that decision. And that particular case went up and down between the Attorney General for years around whether or not somebody who had experienced domestic violence and her abuser happened to be in the military would be eligible for asylum. And so finally, you know, her personal case was decided, but the matter of whether or not a domestic violence victim actually could get protection under our asylum laws was still unresolved because of conflicting opinions and proposed regulations that never got published, et cetera. And so finally, a few years ago, there was a case, ARCG, I believe it was called, finding that a domestic violence survivor, you know, could be eligible for asylum. And I believe that analysis was around being a member of a particular family, if I remember right. And so back in 2018, though, during this administration, the Attorney General Sessions at the time decided that he was going to overrule ARCG and took up the case matter of AB that, from my perspective, fundamentally misunderstands the nature of domestic violence, characterizing rape and abuse as private matters that governments don't have a responsibility to address. And so when he issued that decision back in 2018, he specifically put in language that talked about, you know, domestic violence cases generally being, or, you know, cases involving private actors or non-governmental actors as not meriting asylum protections in our country. And as recently as about a month and a half ago, the administration issued proposed regulations that basically codified that holding in the AB case that talks about how harm by private, well, I mean, it redefines what persecution is. The rule also redefines, clarifies or specifies that particular social groups don't include survivor domestic violence. Generally, cases involving domestic violence don't fall under that. Really trying to shift it away from cases involving non-government actors. And so it really just, the regulations on top of Sessions' decision really take us back into the dark ages where women's rights and the ways that women are harmed in particular aren't recognized as human rights, and ignores the fact that the Refugee Convention and the law talk about a requirement that if the government fails to act or fails to prevent the harm, that is a factor to be considered in the asylum, asylum decision. And so, we are, of course, working on our colleagues at across the country are litigating these cases and challenging the decisions being made on a regular basis. But unfortunately, what we're seeing is a lot of people don't even get to being able to apply for asylum because the folks doing screening are screening people out altogether if the claim involves domestic violence in some way. So there are a lot of pieces in the system that we have work to do on in terms of trying to recognize the ways in which women are harmed. Sorry.
Thank you,
Another long
Grace.
answer.
No, actually, I think given how much you were trying to summarize of such an extended history of the case law, that was impressive to do it in a short period of time. And I think it's a great point, Grace, that you made about the fact that, like, even if we think that some of the legal decisions are wrong, how they can still have, they can be difficult to challenge. And I know for us, for example, one of the issues has been with the increase in immigration, ongoing, I should say, immigration detention. Some clients who we think could have an avenue to challenge things, right? Even if we tell them, but then we have to tell them, like, in order to succeed, you're going to have to go on these long appeals, but you're going to lose at the immigration court level. You're probably going to lose at the Board of Immigration level. And so this means like months, sometimes years, potentially, of detention. Yeah. Legally they may have a case, right? But they may just decide they don't want to take that on. And so that's a horrible situation to contend with, because we're talking about, the right to gain protection. And people may decide that the impact of detention is such that prevents them from accessing those protections. Yeah. So I want us to, I want us to try to, like, hopefully end this on a little bit more of a hopeful note. But before I go to the hope and talk a little bit about the future and the new administration, I did want to ask you briefly if you could talk about, we talked about sort of this history of challenges that in some ways have been in place even before the administration. We talked a little bit about some of the changes that the administration has made, but I'm curious about the pandemic, right? And what the last 8 or 9 months have meant for survivors, particularly survivors of domestic violence, because we've heard a lot we've heard some in the news, but maybe not as much as I think we should be hearing. And so I'm just curious of, like, what you're seeing. And I would especially ask you to share your thoughts on, like, particularly on the issue of, like, both immigrant communities, because there's the broader issue of gender-based violence, but specifically talking about immigrant survivors. And of course, the vast majority of immigrant survivors are people of color. And so, how is that? Because, there's also a lot of evidence about the sort of the overlapping impacts, right, of like the economic disparity impacts, the health impacts. And so where do you see the situation for people experiencing gender-based violence, particularly during the pandemic, before we turn to the hope? So I know this part is going to be a little bit early.
Not so.
difficult?
Yes. Well, I mean, we do know from our colleagues around the country, and my organization is kind of a network, has a network of culturally specific organizations around the country that serve Asian and Pacific Islander and Arab survivors of gender-based violence. But what we do know, what we've been hearing is because of shutdown orders or that the violence that people are experiencing is more severe, that the levels of injury that people are finally reporting, when they ultimately do, that the violence is much more injurious, I guess, and because of people being stuck at home. As restrictions loosened up a little bit, we heard from advocates that about the kinds of help that people were needing, and so there's been a whole bunch of different layers of things that have been happening. A lot of immigrant survivors of gender-based violence, they may not speak another language, they may not speak English, they may be only have one point of contact, if any, outside of their household, and so folks are really isolated. And so what we hear from the advocates is that they're that one point of contact, and they're the source of all of the information that these survivors are getting. And so in these culturally specific organizations, they're doing relaying information about the disease, how it's transmitted, testing about it, all the stay-at-home order information, all of the public information that many of us we take for granted in terms of how much is coming at us around the disease itself, and mask ordinances, all those kinds of things that there needs to be that point of contact for certain immigrant survivors to be able to get information. But we also know folks are even more so concerned about calling the police or, reaching out to the criminal legal system for help, because, when we know that if the police come, likelihood that they're going to be, somebody who's been arrested for domestic violence can be held very long is not very high because of the concern about the pandemic. People are also concerned, they don't necessarily want their abuser to be, potentially exposed to the virus to bring home either. So there's that issue. But we also know about all sorts of concerns financially about immigrant survivors in particular not being eligible for a lot of the relief that's been made available. Folks are not necessarily eligible for the stimulus rebates if they don't have a social security number, even if they've paid taxes, even if the rest of their family, their children, their spouse are US citizens. They, if there's somebody in the household that doesn't have a social security number that, files taxes, then they're not eligible for that stimulus relief. And then there's concerns that for people that have lost their jobs, whether they're even eligible for unemployment insurance, because you have to have valid work authorization and be able to return to work if there's work available. And for those that have work authorization that's supposed to be expiring or has expired, the offices, it's been more challenging, and there are a lot of delays for people applying to extend their work authorization, or to be able, their cases are essentially on hold in terms of their immigration status if they've got one. And then lots of folks are ineligible. Really depends for most of the public benefits that are available out there for folks. Depends on exactly what somebody's immigration status is. But we've done a lot of work in Washington to try to make sure that there's relief out there for folks. But it's been really, really challenging around, on top of the layers of people losing their jobs, of being exposed to the disease, of all the things that governments and communities are trying to come up with to try to address them. Folks are either ineligible, or I have to say, a lot of people are afraid to reach out for them, even things that don't impact their immigration status. So some of you may be aware of the public charge rule that was proposed by this administration that expands the reasons for disqualifying somebody from being able to get immigration status if they are deemed likely to become a public charge. And so, notwithstanding the fact that that rule is actually doesn't apply to a lot of people because they either already have immigration status or they have some kind of immigration status that the rule doesn't apply to, or they don't apply to the kinds of benefits that people are asking for, like state-funded benefits, food programs from the state, in-kind supports, whatever. Because of the confusion in the rule, people are afraid to even reach out and get what's available for them because they're afraid that it's going to harm their immigration status. And I'm even to the point of I was talking to a sexual assault advocate a couple months ago, and they mentioned that they were working with a rape victim who didn't want to get a rape kit done because the rape kit and the services that go along with that, even though it has nothing to do with public charge at all, nothing to do with immigration status, they were concerned that having that done, getting free services at the hospital would potentially harm their immigration status. And so it just, it's really heartbreaking that first of all, that so many people who aren't even impacted by the rule are dissuaded from getting help for themselves and their children, for example, their US citizen children. And then on top of it, that the rule, has the impact of separating families and people's support systems. And so there's just this pandemic, there's continuing discussions about all the ways in which immigrant communities and immigrant survivors specifically are really being shortchanged in the discussions. But we got work to do.
We definitely have work to do, and Grace, I couldn't agree more with you about the impact of the public charge rule. And in some ways, we'll probably never know the true damage that has done, because I think one of the things I point out is that part of the problem is that it does mean that people just forego things. I think one of the stories that sticks on my mind is a group of advocates who were telling me about they're doing this is before the pandemic. They were trying to do a breast cancer screening, day, and people were like foregoing that, right? And we'll never know, right? Like how many people we could have, prevented, health challenges. And of course, the rule went into effect, just as the pandemic was getting worse. So it will probably never quantify, but I know the impact is just the human toll has been terrible, and that's one of the things that we should actually turn to now, which is to say, okay, well, now we got, as we talked in the beginning, we are a little over 2 months from a new administration, despite the protests and the complaints from the current president. I think we do expect that there will be a transition of power on January 20th. And so what changes do you see ahead? If you were advising the incoming President Biden, and in some ways I'm sure you are, because I know you're involved in those discussions. What do you see as the most important things that need to be done? And then, give us a sense of like what kind of a little bit of like a wish list of what you'd like to see done, but also kind of more of like, okay, what do you actually expect to be done in the coming months by the new administration, given the reality too of the political reality of still the uncertainty about the Senate, of course. But where do you see things right now?
Oh my.
Another long question potentially.
I know. I have to say that, we've been working on recommendations for months now on all the things that need to be undone. And for anybody who's tracking this stuff, depending on whose list you look at, there's anywhere between 400 to 800, specific administrative changes that need to happen. And so, we've been working in collaboration with with our national colleagues, both in the women's advocacy community as well as in the immigrant rights community, to come up with our long lists of things. But I think, you know, it's hard to prioritize. I mean, you could prioritize based on like the most urgent in the first, you know, like we've been talking about, the first 5, 10 days, first 30 days, first 100 days, versus like what has the largest impact over you know, the largest number of people. And so that, you know, it's a challenge to try to narrow that. But I would say, you know, first of all, to undo the interior enforcement and border security executive orders, especially as they relate to making everybody who's out of status an enforcement priority. Anybody that has been detained or, you know, for violation of some kind of law, being a high priority for detention or removal. I mean, just undoing that would be one. Undoing the border security executive order that expands expedited removal and detention across the country and requires detention of people while their cases are pending if they're detained in that context. So I mean, I feel like that's like a huge so many of the executive actions or administrative actions stem from those two executive orders to begin with, and then you know, the public charge rule. I'm trying to undo that, hoping it's not published in the next 60 days. Excuse me. It has been published. The final rule's been published. Excuse me. I'm confusing it with yet another executive order. I'm thinking about the asylum one. But we've got litigation happening in the public charge rule context, hoping that the administration will order its attorney generals to settle the cases and resolve, you know, those multiple lawsuits, including the ones from Washington state as well as around the country, you know, to undo the public charge rules. In the context of the VAWA, victims of domestic violence, trafficking, crime victim visas, to undo, there was a memo that was published in the last 2 years that refers denied VAWA cases, U visa cases, trafficking visa cases, refers people for deportation if those cases are denied. You know, VAWA has been implemented since 1996. There was always within the administration a decision that even if a case was denied, that those cases wouldn't be turned over for removal unless there was some other, you know, specific criminal reasons or whatever. But what we've seen over the last few years is people being less willing to even apply if for protections that we've, you know, worked on in VAWA, et cetera, if there was a risk of removal. And so undoing that, prioritizing funding to get these cases processed more quickly so that people aren't waiting for 5 years to just determine whether their application for a crime victim visa is even going to be looked at, and issuing, you know, deferred action and work authorization for those folks so that they can leave abusive relationships, not have to return to their abuser if they're you know, if you know, their cases are processed more quickly. To strengthen what the administration calls prosecutorial discretion, guidance. There used to be technically the prosecutorial discretion guidance is still there, but there used to be directives in the agency that said that survivors with pending or crime victims, witnesses should not be detained or put into deportation proceedings, especially if they have they're eligible for some kind of application for relief. I mean, I know we've certainly seen cases where ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement, has told survivors that have crime victim visas pending that they can wait outside the country for the U visa to become available and they can return after that. And so we would, you know, urgently want that to be overturned. We'd want the asylum, like I mentioned earlier, the asylum proposed regulations that codify, domestic violence not being a ground for asylum. The large overhaul of the asylum system, we would want those rules to be paused. We'd want matter of AB, the decision to be overturned. I mean, let me give you a list of 100 things, but I think those are some of the top ones of, I think the big ones: don't detain people while their cases, don't detain survivors. We want to encourage survivors to take advantage of all of the protections under the Violence Against Women Act, not just the immigration ones, but the other services and everything else, to make sure that they're available for people, and to not undermine those protections. But a lot of, the fixes that we need to do are at the legislative level. And unfortunately, we're going to have to figure out how that gets done in the next, I don't know how long, but there are larger system fixes that need to happen outside of the administration. But yeah, I think there's a lot of undoing that needs to happen within the administration first.
Grace, I see a question from the chat from Liz Dunbar, a longtime ED at Tacoma Community House, and one of our close friends, about how we can help advocate for positive changes within the administration. I mean, I think this is one of the concerns that I do have, is that you just mentioned a very, very long list, and that's just in this very specific area. And of course, the administration is going to have the pandemic, the economy, all kinds of issues in so many different fronts. And so I think a lot of folks are concerned that this is not going to rise to the top of their priorities. What do you see as being effective in terms of that, of our being able to push, like we've voted, right? And so what are the points of pressure that you see as advocates of making sure that this becomes a priority for the administration?
I do, more than anything else, getting the real life stories about how people have been impacted, and lifting up their experiences is really important for all of us doing. To make sure that your senators know, make sure that your House members know, with respect to the administration, making sure that the governor knows, and the folks within the within the administrations. I know Liz is very familiar with some of those folks about the experiences that people are having, and to the extent that we can share those stories and gather the information to lift that up. I think that it is really challenging trying to figure out, sequencing, I think, I know that there's a lot of effort going in from lots of folks about what needs to be done quickly, what needs to be done, urgently, and knowing that there will be work over the next several years to try to undo some of the harm that has taken place. But I can't impress upon folks enough the need for, both at the legislative level and at the administrative level, just lifting up the impacts of how the pandemic itself, but even predating the larger pandemic of racism and xenophobia, what those impacts are on the human services needs, on the safety of individuals in our communities. And so, I welcome examples, because, we're working on litigation, we're working on trying to lift up those pieces for courts to consider, as well as the government folks, the policy folks. So, yeah.
Well, thank you, Grace. And I see one last question. I'm going to tackle this one before we wrap up. And this is it's an interesting question, because it talks a little bit about how, from Anna, the U.S. is one of the few developed democracies that has not ratified some fundamental human rights conventions, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination, or the Convention on the Rights of Children. and Anna asks about how that practice of the U.S. being kind of exceptional in that sense, and that's kind of not a positive sense of the word exceptional, or in this case, exemptionalism is the way that Anna put it. That has an impact on asylum seekers and the rights of non-citizens. Where do you see that? Do we see a future in which we move away from this mode? I mean, obviously the Trump administration was very like America first, and so it was not going to be swayed by arguments around, international obligations. But it hasn't been clear that even the Democratic administrations have been completely swayed. Do you see more of a hope in that area?
I mean, I think that certainly my colleagues that do the international women's work, they have been organizing, and I think there will be more of an ear in this next administration. But I think it's both. I mean, it involves all of us engaging with unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your perspective, with our Senate as well in terms of getting these treaties ratified. And so it means that all of us need to be educating our communities to be weighing in on the need to participate in these international treaties. And so, there's just so much work that we need to be doing to educate our policymakers. Yes, certainly, if they're not hearing about the need to be ratifying these treaties, they're certainly not going to be organizing to do that at the congressional level, or pressuring the White House to do anything. But I just feel like at the community level, your friends and your neighbors, just we're just not, I think, as a larger community, engaged in some of these discussions about international relations and et cetera. So.
Yeah, and sorry, I missed one question earlier from Pearl about the that I think Rebecca's already addressed, but the question was about whether the lifting of the number of e-visas allowed that we discussed earlier, that limit could be done by executive order, or does it need a statutory fix? And unfortunately, the answer is that it does need to be a change of statute. So that's not something that the administration could do on its own. But I think
they can lend their weight to pushing for it. So there's that.
That is definitely something, and I think the point that you made, Grace, which is that if they can move to provide protection, because even now there's such a delay between people having their applications even considered for that initial deferred action, that part can be done by executive change of policy, essentially. And I think that would still have, even though it's not the same as removing the statutory cap, because it still means that people will be waiting for a long time to obtain full protection, it does mean that people will get that work permit and at least some sense of the direction of their applications. So
if people are interested in that particular topic at this moment, this particular one, so at this very moment, there are negotiations happening for fiscal year 2021 appropriations. And it's not clear whether or not the Department of Homeland Security appropriations will actually ultimately be considered in that package, because the House, there still hasn't been a bill passed either out of the House or the Senate relating to funding for the Department of Homeland Security. But what did happen, and we worked on this on the House side, was back in the summer, the House Appropriations Committee passed a Department of Homeland Security appropriations bill. There is language that passed the committee that says that no DHS funding will be used to detain survivors with pending UVAWA and T cases, U-Visa, Violence Against Women Act, trafficking victim cases. And there's also report language that goes along with that bill, the House bill, that says that U-Visas should be reviewed quickly, and work authorization, should be reviewed within 90 days, and work authorization should be reviewed within, or issued within 6 months. So we have been talking with our delegation and others about making sure that if a DHS bill, appropriations bill for fiscal year 21 goes forward right now, that those be priorities in the final package. So that's a little bit in the weeds, but that, you know, that's what we're doing these days. So, I mean, there's all sorts of discussions right now about fiscal year 21 appropriations and, you know, the state of our economy in the next, over the next year. And so we'll see.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Grace. And I want to sort of give you one chance for any sort of final parting words of as we wrap up today.
So I just, for folks who are more interested in learning about the policy issues, you know, we don't do the practice. We rely on folks like the staff in the VAWA unit at NWIRP to do the practice work. But if folks are really interested in being more engaged on policy issues as it relates to gender violence and immigration, we have a national, what do we call ourselves? Alliance. And I'm typing it in the chat right now. Okay. The Alliance for Immigrant Survivors, where our organization, along with several other national organizations that are tracking the policy work. We have updates on regulations and legislation on a regular basis. And typically every month there's an action item to be taken on. I think right now it's about COVID, or I can't remember what the latest one was. But I encourage you to just sign up for the list and get updates every couple weeks about, you know, what you can do. I mean, we usually have at least 1 or 2 action items for folks to engage in. And yeah, I think that would be my parting thought. And I'm thank you for the opportunity to be able to share, and I'm really thankful that you're still there in the community, and Northwest Immigrant Rights Project is still there in the community. It has expanded so much in the work to support immigrant survivors at a time when they're most vulnerable. So.
Well, thank you, Grace. And, you know, of course, all of that is thanks to the community here locally in many different ways, including through a lot of work and partners at the state and local level that have enabled us to be present for survivors and more broadly the immigrant community here in our state. We're grateful for you and your advocacy. I also want to just leave people off with the fact that, you know, a lot of Grace's work is done through the Asia Pacific Institute on gender-based balance. And so we encourage people to support that work as well, because it's helping move policy at the national level. So please also visit their website and support their work. And Rebecca is going to be following up with all of you with some additional resources. So keep a lookout for their email with some additional resources for everyone, because there's a lot of work to do, as Grace said. And so I think a lot of folks, you know, think like, oh, well, you know, we have a new Democratic administration, things will be better. And well, there will be opportunity. In fact, I think there will be more opportunities for advocacy. But actually that might mean like even more work in terms of making sure that we push in the right direction. So please stay engaged. We appreciate that you spent this time with us today. But I hope this is only the beginning or the ongoing conversation, and that you'll continue to be engaged in these topics, because we desperately need, and most importantly, the communities that we're serving desperately need your advocacy. So thank you for all of your support, for being with us. And thank you again, Grace, for your participation.
Always.
Great. Thank you so much.